Hi, everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. I'm here with Gil Smart, our Policy Director at Friends of the Everglades. We're doing a check-in with you on Give Miami Day. Thank you, first of all, to those of you who have donated to us on Give Miami Day. This is a big event for us at Friends of the Everglades. It's our biggest online giving event of the year, and that's because the Miami Foundation offers matching dollars up to a certain point for the money you give. So want to thank you for that. And we're going to tell you a little bit about what your donations, your support on Give Miami Day helps us accomplish at Friends of the Everglades. So join us here. Say hello in the chat if you're tuning in live on Facebook or on YouTube. We're going to make this pretty informal. If you have any questions, we may even try to get to them. We'll chat for a few minutes here on this Thursday afternoon. So it's Give Miami Day, as I mentioned, and Friends of the Everglades has the goal to reach $40,000 by midnight tonight. Happy to say that we are about halfway to that goal. So thank you very much again to everyone who supported us. It's meaningful and it's impactful to our work. So again, Friends of the Everglades was founded by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in 1969. We're very proud of that grassroots legacy. And an event like today's Give Miami Day really empowers what we strive to accomplish. A couple things to mention before I tell you about those accomplishments and what we're working on. This is a really meaningful year for us. It's both the 75th anniversary of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas's book, The Everglades River of Grass. That book really changed the way people look at the greater Everglades ecosystem, and it really informs our work today. You know, Marjorie was a writer, a communicator, a storyteller. Gil and I both have those backgrounds, and we are really honored to continue her legacy, and your donations help us do that work. It's also the 75th anniversary of Everglades National Park. The actual birthday is on December 6th. So we'll be celebrating that just, gosh, a couple weeks here. Hard to believe that next week is Thanksgiving and December's right around the corner. So, you know, when Marjorie founded Friends of the Everglades in 1969, it was actually for a very specific purpose. She had written the book, The Everglades River of Grass, in 1947. So 22 years later, she decided she needed a group. She was in her 70s by then, and she decided to found a group for the purpose of stopping a major airport, a jet port, from being built in what's now the middle of Big Cypress National Preserve. And luckily, Friends of the Everglades and other opponents were successful in stopping that jet port from being built. But actually, if you go to Google Earth and pull up the Everglades jetport, you'll see that a single runway actually stands right now in the middle of Big Cypress. It's a training ground now for air training. And it reminds us that these bad projects are curtailed often. These victories aren't 100% pure. They're very hard fought battles, and it's very much what we're engaged in today. So that brings me to the news of the week in Miami-Dade County. And I know many of you tuned into that at the Miami-Dade County Commission meeting, where on Tuesday and for more than a year prior, we've been fighting a really terrible development proposal. The South Dade Logistics Center was originally proposed for 800 acres on green space and homestead, low-lying, coastal high hazard area, close to Biscayne National Park, not far from Everglades National Park, outside the urban development boundary. Every agency that weighed in on it practically objected to it, from the Army Corps of Engineers to Department of Interior, to the county's own planning staff, which issued a scathing rebuke. And yet the project was still approved, albeit in a smaller footprint. So it's now going to be more than 300 acres. And of course, we expect that to be challenged because it's still in defiance of Everglades protection and restoration and a threat to Biscayne Bay. So, you know, Gil, I'll ask you to just chime in. We see bad development proposals all over the state, and I know you watch them as our policy director. What was your take on the Miami-Dade vote this week?
Well, it's just, I mean, to say it's disappointing doesn't even begin to cover it. I mean, look, you just said it. This is outside the urban development boundary, right? This is within the footprint of SERP. This is land that basically is supposed to be, conserved as part of the attempt to sort of restore the Everglades. And here we're going to put warehouses on it. We're going to put so and this is the problem, the rampant development in Florida just leaps every hurdle that is put in its way. The whole idea of an urban development boundary is we're supposed to keep development within the urban development boundary, but it's sort of roundly being ignored. We had a similar situation here in Martin County with a few months back, different but similar in that, here was a development proposal, rural lifestyles, looking to sort of leapfrog the urban development boundary. And it's, we set these boundaries and it makes sense from a planning perspective. You want to keep development in, certain areas and out of certain areas, but it just gets ignored. And unfortunately, the culture of the political culture that we have is such that developers just often get their way, even when, as you said, virtually every government agency is lining up and saying, this is a bad idea. Boom, it gets rubber stamped anyway. So
right. So when you support Friends of the Everglades on Give Miami Day or at any time, you underwrite and empower our work to fight these bad proposals. We're honored to work with arguably the most talented and experienced environmental land use attorney in the state, Richard Grosso. We've worked side by side with him on the South Dade issue and in Martin County, actually. So that's really important work. And we are outnumbered, outmanned. I think that's a line from Hamilton. But at every turn, the developers have many more paid consultants, attorneys working for them than we do. So your support really helps us provide a counterbalance, a counterweight to those forces of greed often that are not in the best interests of Florida as a whole. So thank you for that. And we invite you to support us this Give Miami Day. I feel like I'm on an infomercial here. But it really is important and appreciated. So I'll just give you a few other examples of what your contributions support when you do give to Friends of the Everglades. A big part of our work over the past year has been weighing in on Lake Okeechobee management. So the Army Corps of Engineers has spent 3 years writing a new Lake O plan. The new one is going to be called LOSIM, the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. The current one is LORS, Lake Okeechobee Regulation Schedule. So we've been at the table at every meeting practically, pushing for the Army Corps to take into account toxic algae blooms when it decides how to move water in and out of the lake, primarily out of the lake, because you'll recall that in 2018 and 2016, we had horrid toxic algae blooms that affected both coasts. And meanwhile, the Southern Everglades needs more water than it's receiving. So this new plan, I'm happy to report, it's not a panacea. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, so to speak, but I'm happy to report that it does, for the first time, recognize the threat of toxic algae blooms. So public health is acknowledged in the new plan, and there will be more flexibility in the new plan, which will take effect next year. The other thing that's in this plan that we hadn't seen in the past is just an acknowledgement that the Southern Everglades needs more water. That also was not in the plan in the past. The plan in the past, honestly, had a couple of main priorities. From the Army Corps' perspective, it was to protect the Hoover Dike around the lake. And then from the Water Management District's perspective, it was largely to maintain flood protection, flood control, and irrigation of sugarcane in the Everglades agricultural area. So we're getting a little more balance. We're not where we need to be, but to turn that freighter took a lot of man hours, a lot of pushing at meetings. It's what Gil and I do, and we thank you for your support. And I see we have a thank you in the chat from Gina Crawford. Thank you for the appreciation, Gina. We are definitely honored to do the work we do and appreciate your support. So Gil, I was going to ask you to just chime in on the letter we sent this week to the Army Corps of Engineers, because while the new Lake O plan is a long-term strategy, it'll guide us for the next decade, there are also these short-term decisions we have to weigh in on, and the conditions are pretty unusual right now and a little concerning in the lake.
After Hurricanes Ian and then Nicole sort of barreled their way through Florida over the course of just a few weeks, the lake began to rise. The lake prior to Hurricane Ian was actually getting a little low. And some of the stakeholders who are involved in sort of your perpetual lake debates here, those who are concerned about water supply, agriculture primarily, were worried. They were thinking that, this was going to be a problem. There could be cutbacks. what a difference 5 weeks makes. And now we're at the point where the lake has topped 16 feet. It's about 16.25 feet today. That's beginning to make the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers a little nervous. And under the current lake schedule, LORS 08, as he mentioned, they could start discharging to higher volume discharges to the West Coast. The West Coast needs some discharges to maintain salinity levels, but not a whole lot. And they're begging for no high volume discharges over there because right now the west coast of Florida is being crushed by a growing red tide bloom, which seems to be getting worse by the day over there. I don't know if you've seen some of the imagery out of the area over there, the fish kills. There's a lot of people reporting respiratory distress. It's a real growing problem. And the fear, and it's a very legitimate fear, there's a recent study that cited this, the fear is that additional runoff, nutrient-laden runoff, is going to make the problem worse. Well, that's what's coming down the pike, as a result of these storms. That's what's going into Lake Okeechobee as it rises. If there are higher volume discharges to the West Coast or the East Coast, that's what's going to be. That's what we're going to see. We're going to see this nutrient-laden water, which on the West Coast could exacerbate the red tide. Algae blooms are not really a problem at this point on our side, but we don't want over on the Atlantic coast, we don't want the discharges either, because we're already having the extreme turbulence as a result of these storms, which has been stirred up in our estuary. The seagrass had just begun coming back. Oysters had just begun coming back. It's been almost 2 years since the last round of discharges. Now we got all this turbulence. If on top of that, we begin high volume discharges, it's just going to be bad news. So this morning, Friends of the Everglades sent a letter to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Colonel James Booth, the commander of the Jacksonville District, formally requesting that the Army Corps hold off on high volume damaging discharges to both coasts, because we believe there's, historical evidence suggests that the lake has been this high at this point of the year before, and where we have not had to have discharges. We're concerned about the ecological impact on both coasts. We think that the Army Corps can hold back on the discharges and it's not going to be a big problem. But we also said that if the Corps absolutely positively decides there have to be discharges, they need to consider sending water south of the lake rather than to the estuaries. They need to consider sending water to water storage areas, stormwater treatment areas south of Lake Okeechobee, ultimately the water conservation areas south of Lake Okeechobee. The argument is that there is no room at the end, so to speak, that those stormwater treatment areas are full of lake water coming off, or water rather coming off the Everglades agricultural area. But we said, even if it's only on a temporary basis, if there's some, STAs, stormwater treatment areas, that are under construction or being rehabilitated at this point, perhaps they could be utilized temporarily on a temporary basis to accommodate some of this water, so we can make flows to the estuaries unnecessary. Our line was, it's going to, flows, increasing harmful flows to the estuaries or discharging harmful flows to the estuaries is going to do far more harm than good. So
that's right. And keep in mind, it's November 17th. We are very close to the dry season here. The Herbert Hoover Dike around the lake is finally rehabilitated. Gil and I were in a meeting today with Lieutenant Colonel Polk of the Army Corps of Engineers, where he said the dike safety is no concern right now. So we have more freeboard than we used to in the lake because of that improved dike safety. And we're talking just a couple weeks here before we get to dry season. Let's not blast the coast unnecessarily, with the West Coast facing really bad red tide conditions, not needing more nutrients, and the East Coast also, looking worse than it did a few weeks ago, that's for sure, in the St. Lucie estuary because of the turbidity from the storms that we had here. So Gil and I weighed in person with Lieutenant Colonel Polk. We sent a letter today. That's just another example of the kind of work we do at Friends of the Everglades. Those of you who are watching, you have day jobs, you have busy lives. You can't sit through these very tedious meetings like Gil and I do. But we are honored and happy to do this work. And it's not just about meetings either. We wade through research, we communicate, we tell stories, which brings me to another point about our work. A big part of what we did in 2022 was bring to video a mini documentary series about sugarcane burning in Florida. And our multimedia producer, working with our director of communications, Leah Voss and Ali Hartman, collaborated to go into the Glades communities where one of our board members, Robert Mitchell, is from, and talk to people who live in the Glades communities south of Lake Okeechobee about the really dire impact that sugarcane burning has on their health, their lifestyle, their quality of life overall. So really proud of the videos that were created. You can go to our website, everglades.org, and you'll see up in our rotator there, you can watch all of the short videos that were created. And actually this coming Monday, we're debuting the final video in that series, a roundup about the issue. It's narrated by one of the residents of the Glades, Keena Phillips, who's an advocate with the Stop the Burn campaign. And it's another part of what we've been engaged in this past year, because the sugarcane industry, as you might imagine, doesn't like to talk about the harmful impacts of the smoke that is allowed to burn, the fields that are allowed to burn, and the smoke that's produced when the winds are blowing towards the Glades communities to the west, but not to the east. It's really the most egregious example of environmental injustice in Florida. The rules are just blatantly biased, and we're working to change that. And we're honored to do that work with your support. So check out those videos. Keep an eye out for the next one on Monday. And we'll keep calling for an end to sugarcane burning in Florida, because that is really the very simple solution, and it has to be done. I see that we have a few more comments in the chat. Thanks to those of you who have chimed in. And we also have a link to Give Miami Day. So just a reminder that today is Give Miami Day. That's why Gil and I are popping in here to tell you about our work, the impact of your dollars when you give to Friends of the Everglades. And until midnight tonight, your donations through the Give Miami Day portal can be amplified when you give to Friends of the Everglades. So one last point I'll make is that we're honored to have a Young Friends of the Everglades program here at Friends of the Everglades. It was actually started in the 90s in Miami-Dade County Public Schools. One of our board members, Connie Washburn, co-founded that program in her fourth grade classroom at Howard Drive Elementary. And for years, it existed and connected with tens of thousands of students in Miami-Dade County. Well, due to a variety of factors, that version of the program went a little dormant years ago, and we've just revived it this year with Everglades Learning Exploration Kits that we are delivering to 10 classrooms across the South Florida region and the Treasure Coast. And just this past week, we delivered a kit to Morningside K through 8 in Miami-Dade County. These kits include professionally developed lesson plans about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, about how stormwater treatment areas work. It's actually useful for adults to read those, because the plumbing of the Everglades is really complex, and they're beautifully illustrated. And the kits also include classroom copies of books for the students. So Marjorie really believed in educating the next generation, and we're happy to carry on that torch as well. So that's a bit about our work at Friends of the Everglades. Gil, would you like to add anything that I may have missed?
Well, no, I mean, we're going to be gearing up here after the first of the year. The legislature is going to come back into session in March, and that's always an important time of year because there's a lot of bad bills that come down the pike. There's a lot of good bills that need some support. So that's another aspect of our work here is to both identify bills that need stopped and support bills that ought to go forward. This year we've heard anecdotally that there's going to be some bills that we're definitely going to oppose. Last session, there was a bill for it was called Seagrass Mitigation Banking. It was the second year in a row that had been introduced in the legislature. It died in committee. We're hearing it's going to come back. And the essential gist of that is basically you can destroy some seagrass over here so long as some is planted over there. It's a terrible idea in a state where seagrass die-off has been, a huge problem, and it continues to get worse. We ought not be thinking of ways to destroy more of our natural environment, but yet we are. But then, by the same token, though, too, there's said to be a bill this year that would take the rest of the recommendations of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force and write them into law. Only a few of the recommendations of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force were written into law a couple of years ago in 2020's Clean Waterways Act. There's a whole bunch more recommendations, things that we ought to be doing to make sure that we can protect ourselves from harmful blue-green algae blooms. There was a bill last session, House Bill 561, that died in committee. What we're hearing is that there's going to be another attempt to get the legislature to, again, take these the suggestions, the recommendations of this top panel of scientists as to how we can prevent this problem and make them into law. That's a bill worth supporting, and so we're definitely going to do so.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing up our legislative work, Gil. We are actually going to be expanding our legislative accountability work in the year ahead. We were tracking session last year, this past spring, and as the 2023 session approaches, we're going to elevate that work and make it easier for people who follow Friends of the Everglades to weigh in on specific issues quickly. These bills are dense, they change form, it's intentionally complicated, a lot of it. And a big part of our objective here is to make it easy for you to hold lawmakers accountable, to let them know that we understand the long consequences of their actions. That's what Marjorie stood for when she founded Friends of the Everglades in 1969. That's what we continue to stand for today. And we will be tracking legislation as it's filed and letting you know how to weigh in. So thanks for bringing that up. It's always a bear when legislative session rolls around, but so important. And we do achieve some success, mostly defensive success, right? Like we helped kill the bad seagrass mitigation bill last year. Well, we know it's going to be resurrected, unfortunately, or that's what we're hearing at least. And I'm sure there will be others. So thank you to everyone who tuned in to chat with us this Give Miami Day. We do regular live stream clean water conversations. We'll be bringing you more live streams in 2023, but we wanted to touch bases with you today during this online giving event to just talk to you informally about the work that we do here, pull back the curtain a little bit and express our gratitude. We're about halfway to our goal of $40,000 on Give Miami Day. So if you're in a position to support us, we'd be very grateful if you do so.
Absolutely. We do we have to punch up here at Friends of the Everglades because, the other side tends to be very well financed, as Eve mentioned, tends to be very well organized, tends to be, very vocal and in touch with legislators. We punch up. Your contributions, your generosity can help us punch harder. So.
Absolutely. I see Sonia left a comment. Thank you for all you do. Thank you, Sonia, for tuning in. If anyone watching wants to know more about our work, just go to everglades.org, check us out. And today on Give Miami Day, please go to our page there and chip in if you can. Thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful Thanksgiving next week. Take care.